Hello, good morning. I wanted to continue my review of Richard Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene. For this video, I'm only going to cover a portion of chapter 3. I got a bit bogged down. I was reading it yesterday and yesterday night, and I kind of got a bit bogged down, so I didn't get all the way through chapter 3. Oh well, c'est la vie. Title of the chapter called Immortal Coils. He's referring to DNA. So he says, we're survival machines. And the first thing he does, and he says, by we, he doesn't just refer to people. This is Richard Dawkins talking. He says it embraces all animals, plant, bacteria, and viruses. So he wants to equate humanity with plants, bacteria, viruses. They're just all machines to carry genes, according to Richard Dawkins. That's what he says here, right? And he talks about all the different types of things. Now, this is interesting because he goes down here and he says, for simplicity, I've given the impression that modern genes, so he probably realizes from his first two chapters the simplicity of his argument, just primordial soup, molecules, proteins, genes, or some very, very simple progression that just had to happen. He says, for simplicity, I've given the impression that modern genes made of DNA are much the same as the first replicators in the primeval soup. I call it primordial, but he calls it primeval soup. It does not matter for the argument, but this may not really be true. He says it doesn't matter for his argument, but this might not be true. So he just said that in chapters 1 and 2, and now he says it might not be true, but it doesn't matter. Right? It does not matter for the argument, but this may not really be true. The original replicators may have been a related kind of molecule to DNA, or they have been totally different. In the latter case, we might say their survival machines must have been utterly must have been. There's that phrase again. It must have been, right? You had these original replicators that just replicated themselves spontaneously, and then they must have been a related kind of molecule to DNA. Or they may have been totally different. He's saying whatever he wants here. He's just saying, well, it might have happened like that, might have been, but it had to be something because, I wrote here, he says, he presents no evidence other than his own words. He equates humans to viruses. He goes from replicator to molecules to DNA, and then he uses the phrase, DNA works in mysterious ways. So again, he's saying the purpose of his book is to show, what did I say? Let's not lose track of ourselves here, because my mind is like a fried egg. I can get easily distracted. What did we say was his purpose? To examine the biology of selfishness and altruism. But he takes every opportunity that he can to poke fun at God. If he was truly a scientist, a zoologist, or a biologist, or whatever you want to call him, why would he stray from scientific data, scientific research, to go off and make these cute little comments like, DNA works in mysterious ways? Seems a little unnecessary, don't you think? So he's saying here, if so, the original replicators were utterly destroyed. No trace of them remains in modern survival machines. He calls us modern survival machines. So modern survival machines, we have DNA in our body. And if you go back as far as you can to find the earliest remains of human or even near human-like or ape-like or whatever you want to call it, animals, creatures, they have DNA in them as well. There is no sign of these replicator genes. There's no sign of something prior to DNA for the building blocks of life. And that's the problem he runs into. He says, well, it doesn't have to necessarily be true since there's no evidence of what he's talking about. He says it must have happened, right? It must have been seized at a later stage by DNA. He used the word seized. So the modern DNA must have seized these replicators. You got to admit, it's lame from any angle you come at. It's just, and that's why I got bogged down. I was reading this and I had to read it over and over again and saying, is this really what he's trying to say here? is lame. But I'm going to refrain from bashing, or try to refrain from bashing, because I got so out of control in the first video. I'll try and tone it down a bit for the good guy that Richard Dawkins, I'm sure he is. So then he goes through, and if we read through, he starts to talk about DNA itself, and he talks about the the four written instructions, A, T, C, G, and each cell is as if it's got like 46 volumes. But I want to bring to your attention here, I know it's taken me a long time to get through this, but he wants to use a metaphor for the complexity of DNA. And so he talks about there's these volumes of information in each cell, and he has no way to explain where these cells ever originated. He gives no data or evidence or even a reasonable theory, although he does come up with a different theory. I'll give him that. He does come up with an original theory, and I'll lay it on you in a second, because it's quite a marvel. But in the meantime, he says he wants to use the metaphor of, lo and behold, an architect. The lo and behold is my part. He's looking at the complexity of DNA, and he says, wow, it's amazing. You got this volumes and volumes of information. Must have been an architect that made this somehow, right? The architect's plans runs to 46 volumes in man. Number is different in other species, right? I shall make use of the metaphor of the architect's plans, freely mixing the language of the metaphor with the language of the real thing. He considers himself a real language magician, Richard Dawkins does. Volume will be used interchangeably with chromosome. Page will provisionally be used interchangeably with gene. So he's making up new terms as he goes on the fly. The metaphor will take us quite a long way. When it finally breaks down, I'll introduce other metaphors. Incidentally, of course, there's no real architect. So he's saying here, I'm reading this verbatim, but I'm embellishing it for me and you, right? He said, incidentally, there's, of course, no architect. He puts architect in the little quote. The DNA instructions have been assembled by natural selection. Simple. He goes back to Darwin's term, pulls out Darwin's term. See, Darwin, when he wrote, he was observing. He went on a 5-year journey in the Beagle, in the boat, traveling all over the world, and he observed and he documented everything he saw. And Darwin wasn't afraid to say sometimes, I have no idea how that could have come about, or I have no idea how that. He was a geologist, how that particular formation. He was very insightful on a lot of things, and a lot of things he had theories. But he never admitted to knowing everything about what he saw. Richard Dawkins is devoid of any such humility. He just says, I'm going to make up terms, and then I'll use them for my own. In fact, let me give you a quote here that he says. This is what he says. I believe this is from further down, so I'm jumping ahead of myself. But he says, we can define a word how we like for our own purposes, provided we do so. He's using the royal we here, but I'm quoting him for verbatim. We can define a word how we like for our own purposes, provided we do so clearly and unambiguously. Oh, that's a quote from G.C. Williams. I apologize. So he's borrowing this quote from G.C. Williams because I'm pointing to G.C. Williams here. Oh, no, he's referencing. Sorry. I got bogged down. That's why I got bogged down in the chapter, because of comments like that. But anyway, let's go through here. I got to admit, he does really remarkable, excuse me, coffee, work at explaining the complexity of DNA, how marvelous it is, and how amazing the process of creation itself is phenomenal. And between one human and another human, and the idea of the 23 pairs of 46 pairs of chromosomes, and he goes on to talk about the intricate interdependence of genes and all that kind of stuff, and it's really a marvel to start to get into a little bit. And is it any wonder that he uses that metaphor, right? I mean, if I walked into the Louvre or the Taj Mahal or the Empire State Building, this is what his argument is like. And I marveled at how amazing all these complicated structures fit together. And I said, wow, the architect must have really had a vision for this thing. It must have been really remarkable. Oh, but of course there's no architect. These beams and girders, they just came together. The workers came together. They had a fecundity to to be stable, and so they would gather themselves together just randomly from a primordial soup of a population of people, and one person would bring one board and one person would bring another, and then sometimes they would just end up nailing them together, and it must have just appeared out of a spontaneous cooperative effort. There's no real architect. That makes about as much sense as what he's saying here. He's going through describing DNA and saying how complicated it is, the vast amount of data that's required for self-replication to occur. And then he says, must have been an architect. I mean, it's just like amazing. And then he goes, oh, but there's no real architect. That's just from what does he say? Just from natural selection, the term that Darwin used. See, Darwin gave all these atheists an out. They jumped on his terms and said, oh, we don't have to use the word creation. We could use natural selection. The human logic would say, well, this must have been created. This building must have been created by something or somebody, an intelligence of some type. But they don't have to use that term, creation. They can take out that word and create their own terms with their own definitions. And so they do this word play, at least Richard Dawkins is quite adept at it, to fool the reader into adopting their position. They say, well, it had to happen like this because they're so eloquent in how they describe it, right? Then he says, oh, the metaphor starts to break down here, and then he goes on and he creates new terms. He says, well, I'll just call them Sistrons, and I'll make up this new term, crossing over, and, da-da-da-da. He goes on. And some of the stuff, I got to admit, is very interesting. It slowed me down. I thought I was going to breeze through this, and it slows me down. And he's talking about the creation of life with the sperm and the mother's eggs and all that. And it's remarkable that So did I get any other? How am I doing for time? 15 minutes. I should wrap it up. So I didn't get through. I don't want to put my head down because it makes it more boring. That's about it. That's all the notes I got on so far on chapter 3. Just that jumped out at me glaringly is his metaphor of the architect. I just finished recently Michael Behe's book, Darwin's Black Box. And I preferred his previous book, which I read first, which was called The Edge of Evolution by Michael Behe. And very, very detailed, very hard to get through, but very interesting. And it does give you an appreciation for intelligent design. Intelligent design, as you may or may not know, really got lambasted by a lot of people because of the idea of irreducible complexity. And they said, oh, this is not a good argument. Irreducible complexity argument fails because of blah, 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 blah. And Behe did talk a lot about irreducible complexity in his work. But he covers a lot more than just irreducible complexity. He shows the idea of intelligent design in much other different metaphors and analogies and stories about the molecular activity of life itself. And in fact, even Dawkins himself adopts a similar metaphor by using the metaphor of an architect, right? He introduces the metaphor of an architect to explain his point, and then he abandons the metaphor. As soon as it starts to relate to anything that may indicate that there was a higher intelligence involved in designing life, i.e. God for a lot of people, myself included, but it doesn't have to be that way. The intelligent design is a foot in the door for anybody that might have a semblance of wanting to seek God, wanting to pursue God and say, God, why am I here? Is this real? Is all that, that whole rabbit hole on the spiritual angle of things, which is an angle that I've followed in my life. I've sought God, and I continue to seek God. So it's helping me to think. It's helping me to be a little more introspective, and it's getting me thinking about all these things. And he definitely has done some study and work into explaining his ideas. But so far I'm bogged down. I'm in the middle of chapter 3, and I've got another, I think, 12 pages to go before I get to the end of this chapter called the Immortal Immortal Coils, it's called. I'm getting through it, but I'm not. I'm just as disappointed as I was in the first two chapters, maybe a little less so, but certainly not impressed. Not impressed, right? And for anybody to read Richard Dawkins' work and to think, oh my, this is so revelatory that we just came from a primordial soup because he said it. You'd have to be very, very simple to agree or to accept his line of reasoning. But more importantly, show me what Richard Dawkins is missing in his chain of thought, in his line of reasoning, in his logical steps from A to B. He's just using presumption all the way through. He's just saying, well, it must have been like this. Why? Because he said so. That's what he's basing it on. He's basing it on his use of words and metaphor and definitions of words that he can introduce and replace on demand. So show me what I'm missing here. Is there anything revelatory in here that is groundbreaking scientific data? I would challenge any viewer to show me where it is. Mind you, I've only gotten through chapter 3 and half of chapter 3. So I'll work on it. I'll wind this video down, and hopefully I can finish chapter 3 today and provide a brief update on that, and then move on and try and get through. It's 13 chapters, so it's taking me a little longer than I thought. I apologize, but in any event, thank you for watching. Whoever you might be, God bless you. I love you. I believe that God loves all of us and wants us to grow and be happy, the cranky ones of us and the not so cranky. So again, thank you for watching. Take care. Have a blessed day.